All right, so this week, if you notice, I don't have my computer with me. I'm living a little dangerously. I have just a brief outline, so if I sound terrible tonight, you can blame that. But I'm trying to be less dependent on my manuscript. And so we're going to dive into Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 to 23. And so my first question to you, how many of you guys like drawing or writing stories? Okay, it's a good amount of you. Some of you, I know, like Landon, you do projects for 4-H, and then the rest of you guys are in athletics of some kind, or dance or theater. So let's take, for instance, writing. When you guys write a story, like Emma wrote a short story and gave it to Miss Haley and I, did you just like sit down and you're like, I got this idea, and just burn through 80 pages? Or did you have to think like, who are my characters? What's my outline? I'm building a skeleton. I have to, throw some paper in the trash because that wasn't a really good idea, and rework your ideas. Was that what happened? Or did you just pull a Shakespeare and just crank out a story that's flawless? Okay, so all right. Those of you who like to draw, raise your hands again. How many of you like to draw? Okay. So when you draw, do you have this detailed picture in your head, or do you maybe go to a scrap piece of paper and you maybe kind of sketch out something and you're like, okay, this is what I'm visualizing, and then I'm going to go to the actual paper and I'm going to paint it. Coda, do you relate to that? Is that something you do? A little bit of both? Okay. So for me, I'm going to go to a little different realm of my former vocation. We're talking about writing, we're talking about painting, we're talking about this progression, okay, from the beginning of an outline to a story, or the beginning of a sketch to a painting. So for me, before I came here, I worked in the trades my entire life. I was a carpenter, and my dad's a carpenter by trade. And so when we would build houses or garages or any types of stuff, up north we'd have basements. So you'd dig out the basement, and then you lay your footings, you would pour your foundation, and then your house would sit on top of that, and you would build off of that. So you get to the job site, and there's nothing there. There may just be a hole. You have the concrete in the concrete truck. It's just the raw material. You have your lumber that's just laying in a pile that's ready to be built into something. But that's all you have. It's just the elements for the creation. Okay, does that make sense? And so what we see in Genesis is that God, in the first 3 days specifically, He has the elements of creation. He hasn't detailed everything out yet. Why? We don't know. Last week we talked about the Big Bang Theory. Why would God need millions of years to create everything? And the answer to that is He wouldn't. He's all-powerful. But yet at the same time, the other question that we could ask is, why did God take 6 literal 24-hour days to create when He could have just spoke and everything could have came into existence all at once? Everything would have been there, the trees, the animals, humans, the sun, the moon, all those things just put in place immediately. Why didn't God do that? And the answer to that is we really don't know. But I think one thing is to display His beauty and to display the progression of the elements, the raw elements, to the completed product that we see at the end of day 6, where God rests on the 7th day and says, this is very good. So, I don't have a thesis or a proposition tonight, really. I have more of a key point or a key theme, a key observation, if you will, and that is this. If you look at in detail, which is kind of hard to do to scan really quickly, but days 1 to 3 are related to more of God separating and handling the raw elements of the creation. And then in days in 3, but all the way to 6, we see God then adding the touches, the details to His creation, like you guys would if your Coda does a sketch of something, and then after that, then she does the wide brush strokes, and then she gets more fine and detailed as she gets to the completion of her writing, or the painting. For the writing, it would be you do the outline, you think about the characters, you brainstorm, you throw those ideas away, and then you get to your completed product. That's the most similar and yet so separated example I can give, because God is God and we're not. But I hope that visual gives you a little bit better of an idea. There is a progression of creation from disorder to order. And so we're going to look at days 1 through 6, just briefly touch on a point, and then we're going to look at tonight days 2 through 5 in greater detail. So day number 1, if you look at verse number 3 and 4, God separates light and darkness. So that's the separating process. of these elements. Then day number 2, it's the separation of the waters. Day number 3 is the separation of water and land. And then sometime during day 3, we see the finishing details that God begins with adding the vegetation trees, fruit-bearing trees, seed-bearing trees and stuff like that to the creation. Day number 4, he details space with the sun, the moon, and the stars. Day number 5, he adds the aquatic and flying creatures to the oceans, as well as the breathable atmosphere in which we live in, the habitable atmosphere. And then day number 6, he creates land creatures that are going to dwell on the land, along with the crowning jewel of it all, human beings, which are made in the image of God. You are each made in the image of God. You each have a purpose, whether you want to believe that or not. I hope that you believe that. And we talked a little bit last week about how evolution, the Big Bang Theory, those types of beliefs that come from a naturalistic or atheistic worldview are going to tell you that you have no purpose, that you have no worth. And we see the results, the consequences of that within our society, which is very tragic. So let's look at day number 2, verses 6 to 8, if you will read along with me. Moses, the human author, writes, "And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning the second day." Does anybody want to take a stab at what's going on here? Go ahead, Aubrey.
It's like separating the sky.
That's a good one.
The sky, like that separation.
I was really reading it. I'm like, this is such a tricky passage. And so as I was looking at day number 2, I'm like, how do I wrestle with this? And so I think a great way to understand it is looking back to day number 1. The earth was formless and void, and God hovered over the surface of the water. So the earth was in some kind of way either a perfect sphere of water or a glob of water, whether it was fully water or the earth was beneath it and it was covered in water, we don't know. But day 2 tells us that the surface of the earth was covered in water and there was no land. And then God separates the waters from the waters. And so I think the greatest explanation would be like God cutting around the edge of the earth. And the water that belongs to the surface of the earth stays there as the seas or the oceans. And then the rest of the water rises up, which is where we have our habitable or breathable atmosphere. I don't know which one it is. A habitable atmosphere, which is where we live right now. We can see the clarity and everything, but then we look up and we see the sky, the clouds, and that is where the atmosphere would basically begin. And then it goes up. We have, 5 different levels of the atmosphere? You guys probably know who are science people. So God created that, and then the space or the heavens, it would be called above that. So God has created this atmosphere surrounding the earth. And what's the significance of the atmosphere? Why is it necessary? So that we can live. And you think that would happen by chance, that we would have this atmosphere that covers perfectly the entire earth. That seems very hard to believe, okay? So God in this stage is separating the waters. He separated light from darkness, now he separates the waters, and now there is this breathable air between the waters of the surface and the waters of the sky. Now it's not just this, ocean of water above us. We would look at that as water vapor. So it's not visible, but it's still there. And so that would be what God creates. So he's progressing towards the completion of the creation. And he's creating for us this habitable environment for us to live in. But the problem is that we're not living yet, but the entire surface of the earth is just covered in water. So we can't live unless you're Tintin? Is it Tintin? Or The Life of Pi, where he's out on the boat the whole time. You can't live on water. You can't do agriculture. You can't drive a car. You can't do anything. So what do we see next? Well, we see that God creates land and continues to progress towards the creation of humanity, which he is going to then place, the details, placing these things on the land to make it a habitat for humanity. But one final thought in verses 6 to 8 is the phrase, "and it was so." What do you guys think that means? And it was so. Aubrey. That's a good one, and that's absolutely true. We see that in Genesis 1:31. Anybody else? And it was. It was. Okay. So, and it was so. God, what? He declares it. There was no, like evolution to get to this point. He just commanded the waters to separate, the atmosphere to exist. And it was so. And we're going to see that several times throughout this chapter. But moving on to verses 9 to 13. Does anybody want to read that? Actually, read verses 9 and 10. I want to say something, and then we'll go on to the other ones. Emma? Why do you raise your hand? Oh, I'm so confused. You can read. It's totally fine. If you don't want to, though, I'm not going to force you. Yes, please.
Then God said, "Let the waters of the sky flow together into one place, so dry ground may appear." That is what happened. God caused dry land, cut it down, the waters, God saw that.
I like your translation. It says land. Earth, I just think of like the whole earth, like the sea and the ground. So I like that it says land. And so what do we see there? He's separating again, right? He separates light from darkness, day 1, separates the waters, day 2, and now he's separating the waters from the land. Now, where did this land come from? It could have been underneath the water. The earth was a solid core, and then God raised up by the power of his voice the land. That would then be occupied by what we see in the coming days. How it happened, we don't know. I think it's very reasonable to think that God just declared it and it came forth from underneath the water, or God could have just spoken it and it appeared. Either way, God's power is the reason why we have the separation of land and water. Now, you guys know what Pangea is? I remember that in science class. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. We're going to get into that with the global flood, but I'm like, how did we have like a supercontinent and then it broke apart, right? So we as Christians would believe, as the Bible says, that the earth was created and the continents of it were all connected. You'd have to be kind of blind to not see that they connect together, right? And so God did create all of the land in one area, and that's what he says, gathered together into one place. What is that other than Pangea? That is an area where secular science and Christianity connect together. And that's a great piece of evidence for what we believe. So going down to verses 11 to 13 then, we see the conclusion of God separating light from darkness, water from water, land and water. And now he begins to add those finishing touches, those brush strokes, or he begins to write out that story, like you guys would be writing out your story, the final product of it. And so he's adding the details to his creation. Why he takes 6 literal days, we don't know, but I think it's a beautiful picture to see that God is working and crafting the creation, and you see it getting more and more completed until day number 6, which we'll talk about next week. We're going to talk about the creation of humanity next week. So verses 11 to 13. And God said, he declared, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God said that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the 3rd day. So what do we see here? What do we see? Any comments? Yes. Excellent. What's up, Daniel? God creates everything that grows from the ground, okay? Now, a question to ask, since God is speaking forth and land is literally coming out of the ocean, what is the status of the vegetation? What is the status of the grass and the trees and the fruit-bearing trees? Are they seedlings? Adric, you know about that because you have a greenery. Or are they fully grown, matured plants, trees, vegetation? What do you think? Okay. All right. Well, we would say, based on the text, that God has created by the power of his voice all of the vegetation, the trees, fruit-bearing or seed-bearing trees and stuff like that, and they would be mature. Just like Adam and Eve, we see they're not created as children, they're created as grown adults. We don't know what their age was, but they were adults. And so based on the text, based on the power of God, it would be most consistent that God creates a mature earth. Trees, if you were to cut a tree down, you guys know what the rings are on a tree, you would have a tree that would look to be 20, 30 years old or whatever it would be. And this is, remember, this is in a perfect environment that has not fallen yet. And so God creates everything instantly. And as we see in verse number 11, again at the end of verse number 11, and it was so, we see that continually throughout here. God says it, it happens, that's it. And so God could have done seedlings, but one, I would say that's unnecessary, and two, I don't think that really fits into the creation narrative as coherently, and we could talk about that after the reasoning for that, but I don't want to get us off track with. So, is there any, yeah, we'll leave that there. Verses number 14 to 19 then. Separation has been concluded, detailing has begun. And what do we see in verses 14 to 19? And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, up in the skies, in space, to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs, and for the seasons, and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. Once again, we see evening and morning, the fourth day. A literal 24-hour creation day. So what do we see in this passage? What's the purpose of the governing lights? What are the governing lights, and what's their purpose? Oh, yeah. Yes, and what are their purposes? Excellent. And so we observe that, right? We have 4 seasons, pretty much, I think, everywhere. Never traveled anywhere, but I'm pretty sure. UAE, Xavier, has all, maybe a little more mild spring and a little more mild spring and winter, but they still experience different seasons. And that is because of the way that God has set the earth in the universe. God has set the universe and the earth in its specific place. He set the sun and the moon in different places. The sun affects the tide, the moon affects the tide, the sun affects seasons. All of these things are working together. And for all of that, days 1 through 4 to come by chance is just, it's insane. That's not possible. I mean, think about all the complexities of it. You guys know about the equation for gravity? If we were to just tweak the equation for gravity just a little bit, like we would fly off the earth or we would get crushed to the earth. I mean, the distance that we are from the sun, if we were just a little bit closer to the sun or a little bit farther away, I think a lot of you guys know that, we would die. We'd either get burned up or we would freeze to death. And yet all of these things are working exactly perfect. And all of these equations, these mathematical equations, are working in harmony together. I can't believe that that's by random chance. I can't. Even when I wasn't a Christian and I was taught secular science, it's just like, this doesn't add up. How does nothing somehow create something, and not just something, but an orderly universe that looks like it's been fine-tuned by a creator? So I hope that interests you as much as it interests me. But we've established the purpose of the governing lights, seasons, the tide, gravity, all that stuff like that. And again, I think the main thing is that there's no way that the Big Bang could have created that. There's no way that chance could somehow create the order that we have. And God is the intentional divine artist or the divine author. The universe is his canvas, and he's painting out the creation until he completes it on day number 6. He's writing out the story until its completion on day 6, and it's perfect. It's very good, as he says in Genesis 1:31. Now down to day 5. This is where we'll stop for the night, and then we're going to look in depth at day number 6, the creation of animals and also the creation of humanity. So verses 20 to 23 states, "And God said," God spoke again, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. There's a couple things I want to emphasize here as we wrap up day number 5. Number 1, the creation was meant to multiply. God is creating this habitable environment, the oceans, the land, the air, for the sea creatures, the air creatures, the land creatures to multiply, to procreate. And this is the design that God has made between male and female, which we'll talk about next week. That's a pretty touchy subject nowadays, that there's only male and female, but that is how we get the next generation, whether it's animals or creatures of other kinds as well as humans. But God is continuing these finishing touches. He has created the oceans, He separated the waters, as we see in days 2 and 3, and now He's allowing the habitat, or He's placing the aquatic creatures in the waters, in the habitat that He's created for them. He places the creatures of the air into the air that He has created on day number 2 by separating the waters from the waters and creating the atmosphere, the breathable atmosphere, the habitable atmosphere in which we live in. And then finally, He creates them according to their own kind. And that's something He talked about in day number 3. And now here in day number 5, God creates according to their kind. What does that mean? Does anybody got an idea what that means? He's talking about vegetation, seed trees bearing seeds according to their kinds, aquatic creatures, procreating according to their kinds. What does that mean? Xavier. It's okay. So Kaylee likes dogs. My wife is also a massive dog lover as well. So this is the common example that a lot of creation scientists will use. But you take a wiener dog and you take a lab and you can get another dog out of it. One of our elders, Russell Hirschberger, had a dog that was from a lab and a wiener dog, and it was a weird. Russell, if you're watching this, weird is not a mean thing. I don't know what it looked like, but maybe you can know. It was between a lab and a wiener dog. So it was not a small wiener dog, but it was also not a full-grown lab. But we see within the dog kind, like a wolf, a dingo, if you guys know what that is, a coyote, or domesticated dogs, that is the dog kind. And so you can create all different. That's why we have wiener dogs. There was no wiener dogs on Noah's Ark. I'm sorry, honey. So there was no wiener dogs on the ark. They were bred through different types of dogs that came down through history, okay? But you can't breed a dog and a cat. That's not possible. It's a cartoon. If anybody knows Cat Dog, that's one of my favorite cartoons. You can't breed a cat and a dog. It's not genetically possible. You guys know about genetics? Rachel maybe, because she's a doctor. You can't genetically take a cat and a dog. Just like a pineapple tree in day number 3, where he creates the vegetation, a pineapple tree is not going to produce a banana. It's not genetically possible. There's not a makeup in there to allow it. So God has created these structures for the aquatic creatures to create according to their kinds. A tuna fish can't breed with a whale. That's not genetically possible. At least I don't think it is. But again, it's not there's genetical boundaries that God has established. And so dogs will breed dogs, cats will breed cats. And within the cat kind, you have lions, and you have bobcats, and you have cougars, and all these different kinds of cats, but they're within the cat kind, okay? And so that is what God is doing here. He has set boundaries for them. So in conclusion, we see the separation of the major elements, the light and the darkness, the elements of water, the elements of matter, the earth, God separating these things. And then we see Him detailing the creation by adding the vegetation, which is now able to thrive because there is an atmosphere, a habitable atmosphere that we can live in. And he dresses the oceans with aquatic creatures, and the skies he dresses with flying creatures. And then next week, we'll see that he also not only just adds vegetation and trees and fruit trees and all these other things to the land, but he adds land creatures to occupy the land, and then humanity as well. So how do we apply this? You guys are going to talk more about this in your discussion groups with your discussions, but the main thing that I will probably reiterate a lot, because it's a common theme, is that you were not created by chance. You have a purpose. And we see that even though humanity has not been created through the first 5 days. You have a purpose. God has created you. And we see that already by him beautifully painting, if you will, the creation, by calling things into existence and ordering them and structuring them and creating this habitable environment for us to live in. So a question of application is, how can you engage your unbelieving peers with what we know about how we are intentionally created? How can you have conversations with your peers about this? Because we know that science and Christianity, they're not at odds. We understand that based on our worldview, we're going to interpret the universe in two different ways. And so science does show that the Bible is true, it's reliable, that God has created. It's whether or not your worldview allows you to believe in a supernatural being who has intentionally created everything. So I guess my challenge would be to you is think about, and you're going to talk about that more in your discussions, but how do you engage your unbelieving friends? I have unbelieving friends. I have some really strong atheist friends who will mock and make fun of my faith in Christ. How do I engage with them based on what we see in the first 5 days of the Genesis account? So again, we see the goodness of God in this creative process so far. We're going to continue to see the goodness and intentionality of God that is evidence that we are not the product of chance, and as a result of that, it should leave us worshipful people, but also, again, connecting with our unbelieving friends, gospel-sharing people. We understand that God has created intentionally. That should compel us as we look out at the sunset, as we look at the oceans. Who is that? What you doing? Oh. As we look at the oceans, as we look at the sunset, as we look at the Rocky Mountains, be in awe of God and worship of God and give him the glory for that, and then also have those conversations with our friends and say, hey, like, you weren't created by random chance. There's just no possible way. Look at the detail of this or look at that and just think about it. See what Scripture says. There's coherency here. There's no contradiction. May God be glorified in your guys' lives as you make him known. I pray that this study through Genesis, as we see his account of creation revealing to us, I pray that it would bless you and encourage you to see that we are not random chance, that you have a purpose, and that is to serve your God and to glorify him, to make him known.